All right, good afternoon. My name is Ken Scheve, and I'm the director of the Europe Center here at Stanford University. Over the last 25 years, as many of you know, the number of refugees in the world has ranged between 10 and 20 million individuals. It has been and continues to be a global problem that merits the world's attention, regardless of where you're from or what particular region of the world you happen to be interested in. That said, the dramatic increase in refugees over the last several years, especially in 2015, has primarily been a result of the Syrian civil war, and it's posed dramatic new challenges for its neighbors and, of course, for Europe. Across Europe, arguably the most important public policy question today is what should be done about the refugees. This is the question facing the European Union, national governments, political parties, and really every individual European citizen. Over the next year, Stanford Europe Center hopes to provide a forum for thinking about informed answers to this question by analyzing different aspects of what I think is an era-defining public policy problem. Today, our focus is on the rights of refugees and the obligations of states under international and European law, European Union law. We want to learn more precisely what these rights and obligations are and how they are influencing the ways in which Europe is answering the question, what should we do? So to lead us in this discussion, we are fortunate today to have as our primary speaker, Emily Arnold Fernandez. She is the founder and executive director of Asylum Access, an international organization dedicated to making the rights of refugees a reality through individualized legal assistance to refugees, strategic litigation to set precedents for how states treat refugees, and policy advocacy. Through her representation of refugees around the world and her advocacy, Emily is a leader in working toward making the rights that refugees have to live safely, seek employment, have their children educated, and more generally to rebuild their lives respected in practice by countries around the world. Today she will help us learn more fully exactly what the rights of refugees are, what the obligations of states are, how these are encoded in EU law, and how they are influencing Europe's response to the crisis. Commenting on Emily's presentation and adding further expertise to our discussion are Professors Jenny Martinez and Jim Cavallaro from Stanford's Law School. Professor Cavallaro is Professor of Law and Director of the International Human Rights and Conflict Resolution Clinic and the Human Rights Center at Stanford. Professor Martinez is Professor of Law and the Warren Christopher Professor in the Practice of International Law and Diplomacy. They have both published widely and influentially on various dimensions of human rights law and worked extensively on litigation in the United States and around the world. To put it succinctly, we have a great deal of expertise with us today to learn about the human rights of refugees and the role of international law and how Europe approaches this crisis. Please join me in welcoming Emily Arnold Fernandez to Stanford.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's really a delight to see so many faces here, so many people interested in this topic. And I hope that we will have the opportunity for some vibrant questions and discussion. So I'm going to try to use my remarks as a way to kind of set the context, but then I also really encourage you all to participate when we get to the discussion and the Q&A portion, because I want to answer what you're interested in. So I'm going to start by setting a little context, and you'll learn through this why I've put the word crisis in quotes when it comes to talking about the flow of refugees into Europe. I'd like to ask that you remember three numbers. The first is 20 million. The next is less than 1%. And the last is 20 years. What do these numbers mean? There are 20 million refugees around the world. This is in the context of a displacement crisis where there are 60 million people displaced from their homes, and 20 million of them are refugees, meaning that they've been forcibly displaced not only out of their immediate hometown, but out of their country. So 20 million refugees across the world. This is, by the way, the largest crisis of forced displacement that the world has seen since World War II. Less than 1% of the world's refugees over the past several years, less than 1% every year has gotten to the US, Canada, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand combined. So when we hear all of the news about Europe, when we see these really devastating images about refugees risking their lives to come to Europe, I think it's also important that we understand the context that this is actually a very, very tiny fraction of the number of refugees in the world. And despite the fact that countries like UK and France and Germany get more media coverage, countries like Lebanon and Turkey and Iran have some of the largest refugee populations, both through raw numbers and also per capita, that in ways that dwarf what we see in Europe. So even though Europe gets more media coverage, the real crisis, I submit, is in other places. And just to give you the most dramatic example, Lebanon is now home to 1.5 million refugees. Lebanon itself is a country of 4 million Lebanese. Just imagine walking down the street and 1 in every 3 people you see is a refugee. I mean, it's mind-boggling. It's something we can't even begin to imagine. And by contrast, the number of refugees in Europe, the percentage of refugees per capita in Europe is something like 0.63%, right? 63 hundredths of 1%. So we're talking about much smaller numbers when you compare them to the broader population. And the last figure is 20 years. This is the average time that a refugee spends in a protracted refugee situation, often interned in a refugee camp, and if not, then left on the margins of society, on the margins of the economy. In a refugee camp, you're locked up, you're actually not allowed to leave. These are internment camps that we're talking about in almost all situations in the world. And for refugees who are not in camps, but nonetheless are stuck in a protracted situation, they are typically not allowed to work. Often they're not able to walk down the street without fear of arrest, detention, and deportation. They're not allowed to send their kids to local schools. They're not allowed to access local health care. They often have problems accessing local law enforcement, so they have no protection against crime. So they face human rights violations that endure over decades. Think about where you were 20 years ago. I find that often the way in which I interact with this statistic in the most dramatic way is thinking about where I was 20 years ago and what would my life have been like if I had been locked up in an internment camp for that time, or if I'd been living in hiding with no rights to go to school, with no rights to work. Where would my life be? What would have happened to those 20 years of accomplishments? And that's just an average. So that's a fairly grim context to paint for you. But I wanted us to understand what we're talking about on a global level in order to think about how rights play out, both in Europe and elsewhere, and how rights could be a solution to these grave, grave challenges. So refugee law is actually some of the strongest international human rights law that we have. The Refugee Convention is one of the Geneva Conventions passed in the wake of World War II. So the world was fairly serious about human rights at that moment. And the Refugee Convention provides a whole host of rights for people who are refugees, who meet the definition of a refugee. I'll start by just giving you that definition. We talked a little bit about the fact that to be a refugee, you have to be outside of your own country. You also have to be unable or unwilling to return due to a well-founded fear of being persecuted. So you have to have a reasonable fear that you may be persecuted if you go home. Now, that definition has been expanded in recent years, well, I guess in recent decades, I should say, to also include people who are fleeing more generalized civil war or civil violence, right? So if you're a civilian and you don't want to fight,
you might have an argument that you have a well-founded fear of being persecuted because you refuse to take part in an armed conflict. But that's a little bit of a complicated legal obligation to prove. And so the world has said that we need to understand refugees as also including people who are fleeing war or other conflict within their own countries. Now, when you come to the Refugee Convention, the refugee definition, when you talk about the being persecuted grounds for being a refugee, you can't fear persecution on just anything. It has to be on one of 5 grounds. So race or national origin, religion, political opinion, or social group. And social group has been used in a lot of different ways, but it's sometimes used to refer to people who are lesbian, homosexual, bisexual, etc. It has been used to refer to women who are of the right age and target group to face genital cutting, who oppose that cutting and are fleeing to avoid it. So it's been used in a wide variety of ways. It can also refer to your family, right? Maybe you don't have a political opinion that puts you at risk of persecution, but your family, your father's involved in politics, and so you're being targeted because of him. That also gives you grounds for refugee status. And as I said, it can also now apply to people who are fleeing war as well as fleeing specific targeted persecution. So that's who a refugee is. Under the Refugee Convention, refugees have a whole host of other rights, and often when the Refugee Convention is talked about, people really focus on that definition and on the idea that you shouldn't be forced to go home. That's important. It's really important that we don't send people back to be persecuted or to find themselves in the middle of a civil war. But what's also important is how we treat them during those 20 years that they may be in a situation of displacement. And those are the provisions of the Refugee Convention that don't get talked about as much. So the right to work, the right to access wage earning and lawful employment is set forth in the Refugee Convention. The right to access state services, the right to the administrative support of the state, which doesn't sound that important until you think about all the times that you use your government-issued documents to prove who you are, to go transact the business of daily life, to get a driver's license, or rent an apartment, or take any of the steps that would be necessary if you found yourself in a foreign country and had to rebuild your life. So that's what the law says. The challenge with this situation is that the Refugee Convention and other international human rights laws that affect refugees are strong and they're clear. They tell us what nations should be doing. But the enforcement body isn't there. And what I mean by that is twofold, right? First, we all know the challenges with international law. It's hard to enforce international law because there isn't an entity above states that has the authority to force states to do anything, right? We have different UN entities, and they can make recommendations, and they can impose some degree of censure or sanction, but they don't really have the authority to force a state to do something. But the other problem, specifically with the Refugee Convention, is that unlike other treaties, unlike the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, or the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or the Convention on the Rights of the Child, or the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the Refugee Convention does not have a UN entity that primarily focuses on enforcement of that convention. So the UN High Commissioner for Refugees is the body that was created out of the Refugee Convention. It is the body responsible for the Refugee Convention and for refugees. But it sees its primary mandate today as a humanitarian organization, as an organization dedicated to meeting the immediate needs of people who fled their countries. And this is absolutely important, right? We need organizations that are meeting the needs of people the minute that they flee across a border, when they need immediate medical care, when they need someplace to sleep that night, when they need food to eat that day. But that means that UNHCR has really left behind its mandate obligation, the obligation that's actually written into its mandate, to serve as an enforcement body for the Refugee Convention. It also means that when states violate the Refugee Convention, there's no format, there's no forum, there's no opportunity to make a formal complaint to UNHCR the way you might make a formal complaint, for example, to the CEDAW committee about a country's violation of the rights of women. There's no way to say, we're concerned about what this country is doing, we want to complain about it, we want you to investigate, we want you to issue some findings, we want you to issue recommendations. So that mechanism under international law doesn't exist for the Refugee Convention. And that's part of what's behind the way that Asylum Access approaches our work. We do everything from one-on-one legal aid all the way up to legislative and constitutional change in countries that we think have the potential to serve as models for honoring refugee rights. But in the course of doing that work, we take both a legal approach and a practical approach. And any of you who've done policy advocacy, maybe here in the US or with the California state government, know that often the arguments you make are not based just on the law. They're often not based just on what's morally right. They're often based on what's the self-interest of the legislative body that has the power to control this, or the executive body that has the power to control this, and how do we convince them that doing this would be in their self-interest, that passing a law, changing a constitution would be in their best interest. So I'm going to try to bring it back from this legal theoretical perspective back to a concrete example, an example that might be a little more fun, because I know the law can get a little dry sometimes. And I'd like to talk about the right to work. So Asylum Access has dedicated ourselves to making human rights a reality for refugees, but one of the rights we've chosen to focus on is the right to work. When you see refugees coming both from Syria into surrounding countries like Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Egypt, and then fleeing from those countries onto Europe, what we hear from our clients all over the world, and what you see refugees coming out of the Syrian crisis saying, is that if they had the right to work, and to work lawfully, to get paid fairly, everything else would be better. And that's why we focused on the right to work. Also, I think the reason I want to use the right to work as an example here is because I think it's also particularly relevant to the situation in Europe. Because refugees are not getting on boats from Syria and fleeing into Europe. Right? They're not walking directly from Syria and going straight to Europe. They're getting out of Syria. They're finding themselves in a country like Lebanon or Jordan. And they're finding that, in Jordan, the pressure has been increasing to force refugees into the refugee camps that exist, to not let them live freely where they can move, walk around, choose where they're going to live in Jordan, or what they're going to buy, or how they're going to survive. In Jordan and in Lebanon, refugees are not allowed to legally work. And in fact, in Jordan, it's very interesting. There is a minimum wage for Jordanians, but there's no minimum wage for anyone else who's working, either formally or informally in the informal economy. So you can imagine if you're an employer and you have the choice of hiring a Jordanian to whom you must pay a minimum wage, or the choice of hiring someone under the table, or potentially even not under the table, but someone to whom you don't have to pay a minimum wage, your choice may be fairly clear. And so the reason, one of the primary causes of refugees coming into Europe, leaving the Middle East, is that they can't work and they can't make a living for themselves, they can't rebuild their lives. So how does this right to work, which exists in the Refugee Convention, play out in practice? Well, in 2014, Asylum Access conducted the first ever comparative study of barriers to refugee employment and entrepreneurship around the world. This was our Global Refugee Work Rights Report. We did it in conjunction with a coalition that we put together, the Refugee Work Rights Coalition, of organizations working on the ground in 15 countries who could speak directly to not only what is the law on the books, but what is the reality. And you can see this report on our website if you're interested in diving deeper. But what we found is that there are two types of myths that persist and that are really fundamental in preventing refugees from being able to access this right that they do have under international law. One part was economic myths. One type of myth was economic myths. And the biggest economic myth is that refugees take jobs, that refugees undercut the economy. And what this report found is that everywhere that refugees are allowed to work legally, they create jobs, right? They don't take existing jobs and take jobs out of the labor market, but they actually tend to be much more entrepreneurial than local populations. They're much more likely to start businesses, and they tend to be job creators. And in fact, one of the studies that is up here on the screen, the refugee economies out of Oxford, looked in depth at Uganda and found that Uganda's only allowed refugees to work for about 10 years, but 40% of the refugees who'd started businesses were already employing Ugandans in their businesses. That's a fairly short amount of time to go from a policy being passed to the economic realities of how that plays out in the marketplace. So that's one example. And by contrast, where refugees were not allowed to work legally, so we talk about refugees creating jobs, and that's true, but where refugees are not allowed to work legally, one of the things that this ILO assessment showed in Lebanon is that it's not that refugees don't work when you prohibit them from working. It's that they do work, but they work in the informal economy, and they tend to drive down wages and working conditions for everyone. So allowing refugees to work creates more jobs in your economy, increases or maintains job wages and working conditions, and overall has an economic benefit. That was one of the myths that we were able to dispel in our report. And the second type of myth were legal myths. And in particular, we looked at ratification of the Refugee Convention and reservations to the Refugee Convention. And we found that more than 125 countries had agreed to let refugees work, had ratified the Refugee Convention and did not have reservations to the provisions about work. But very few of these countries actually allow refugees to work. And in fact, in 50% of the countries that we looked at, for 50% of the refugees that we looked at, direct legal bars to employment were the biggest barrier to refugees enjoying this right, this fundamental right. And in the other 50%, many of them faced significant de facto barriers. So for example, using Tanzania as an example, Tanzania does not explicitly prohibit refugees from working in the formal economy. But it does say that all refugees are required by law to live in closed camps that are in an isolated region of the country. Right? If you're not allowed to leave a camp that's surrounded by barbed wire, your ability to exercise your right to work is fairly limited. This is an example of what our scorecard looks like, so you'll just see it in the report. But we looked at the how countries are doing on respecting, protecting, and promoting refugees' right to work. As I said, we found that the biggest barrier to refugees working was either domestic legal prohibitions or not having a domestic law that enabled refugees to work. The biggest asset that refugees brought were economic contributions. And the things that we found that were not true, in addition to the myths I've mentioned, is that there's not an economic decline when you allow refugees to work, and there's not a pull factor. Refugees are leaving their countries because they're fleeing persecution or war. They're not leaving because they want to find a job. And so allowing refugees to work doesn't change the number of refugees who are coming, right? And you look at a country like Lebanon, which does not allow refugees to work. You say, okay, they've got 1.5 million refugees. Even when they don't allow refugees to work, probably allowing refugees to work is not going to change the game that much. So what does that mean for us? What does that mean for the refugee crisis, the Syrian refugee crisis and the broader global refugee crisis? What does that mean for Europe and the numbers that Europe is seeing? Still a very tiny fraction, but an important political challenge for Europe. And what should we be doing to address this global refugee crisis and to make the situation better for everyone? I think some of the things you can probably guess, some of my recommendations you can probably guess just from what I've said, right? Despite the political use of the Syrian refugee crisis in Europe, Europe really is taking very few refugees. The US is really taking very few refugees. And in fact, I believe the current numbers are still under, possibly just over, I'd have to check the day-to-day numbers, but the US has only taken about 2,000 Syrian refugees since the start of the conflict for resettlement. Europe, of course, is seeing more because people are coming by boat and on foot, as well as through resettlement programs. But you're seeing very, very few refugees taken in by wealthy states in North America and Europe. In addition, though, I think we need to look at the root causes of why people are coming into Europe. People are coming into Europe because the first places that they take refuge are not viable places for them to rebuild their lives. And some of the background to why this is the case, right? It may be fairly obvious that we need Lebanon and Jordan and Egypt and Turkey, and for that matter, Iran, which has somewhere between 1 million and 2 million Afghan refugees, and Pakistan, not to mention Thailand and Malaysia and Mexico. We need countries that receive refugees, that receive large numbers of refugees, to integrate those refugees into their economies, to change their laws so refugees can work, so refugees can start businesses, and so that refugees can be can participate in the economic and social lives of their communities. But the background to why this isn't happening now, I think one important element to understand, I think, is where investment dollars have been used when it comes to responding to refugees. So right now we have a humanitarian community, we have humanitarian investments in the multiple billions of dollars responding to 20 million refugees, 60 million total forcibly displaced people around the world. And that's a good thing. We need that investment. We need investment in meeting people's immediate needs. But when we look at the length of time in a protracted displacement situation, when we think about 20 years in a refugee camp, 20 years living on urban margins, being told you can't work, but you must depend on aid, we can see that that's not really sustainable. And the solution that has been proposed, and that's been used very effectively in other displacement contexts where people are not outside their own country, are development solutions. So job creation, microfinance, building of markets. That all makes sense if you have market access. But when you don't have market access, then all the development solutions in the world aren't going to work. And right now, we have very, very little, I would say probably in the tens of millions at most, tens of millions of dollars invested in dismantling the legal barriers that keep refugees from accessing their human rights to work, as well as other human rights, their human rights to economic access, to economic participation, which would allow them to move beyond humanitarian aid and provide for themselves, contribute to their host communities, and rebuild their lives. And the lack of investment here, I think, is really showing for us, right? When Asylum Access has been working a little bit with an organization in Jordan that is a highly respected policy think tank, kind of like the Brookings of Jordan. And they've been doing economic policy for a long time. But when we started speaking with them and working with them and connecting them with other scholars, for example, the researchers at Oxford who did the report I mentioned, and started bringing them to international economic conferences to talk about refugees and refugee work rights and the Jordanian economy, this became an issue that they became interested in taking up. And they've had some significant success. About a year ago, I was in Jordan. Almost a year ago today, I was in Jordan. And what we were hearing from everyone was the Jordanian government absolutely will not consider allowing refugees to work legally. That's off the table. We can't even bring it up. We'll get kicked out of the meetings if we do. Don't ask us to talk about it. And through the work of this think tank, and through bringing this issue to the international stage, and also through their work that they've been doing in Jordan, making connections, meeting with policymakers, doing the economic data analysis that's needed to show that this is a benefit, that letting refugees work would actually be a benefit for a Jordanian economy. They've managed to move that to a place where the Jordanian government now is talking about this. They haven't passed a law yet. Legislative change takes a while. But they are talking about making this, making it possible for refugees to work, figuring out what the right policies are to allow refugees to start integrating into the marketplace. And that's a pretty dramatic turnaround within a year. What you need, though, in order to see this kind of thing happen in everywhere that refugees are, is you need investment in organizations like that. You need investment in projects. They've been doing this work on refugees and refugee work rights in Jordan largely, on their own dime without any specialized funding. And one of the things we're looking for right now is some specialized funding to be able to ramp up that work. But historically, we really haven't invested anything in this, not just in Jordan, but everywhere in the world. And part of the reason Asylum Access exists, part of the reason that we're in this space where we're doing legal aid, where we're doing legislative change, is because we saw that that was a huge gap. But we can't do it alone. We're still a small organization relative to the organizations that do humanitarian assistance and development work. And until there's investment in this space, until we actually have a sector in the way that the humanitarian or development communities have a sector, we're not going to see this problem really disappear. So I think that's fundamental. I'd like to just close it up by inviting you to visit our website. There's information there about our work. There's information there about the legal rights of refugees. There's information there about how to get involved with Asylum Access. I don't know how many students we've got in the audience, but we have internships and things like that as well. And I think I'll turn it over to questions now so that we can take it a little further, take the conversation further. Thank you.
So what we're going to do is we're going to have two sets of comments from Professors Martinez and Cavallaro, and then we'll have a Q&A for hopefully about 30 minutes. Okay, Jim, do you want to start?
Sure.
Do you want me to sit up here?
So we sit up here and comment? Okay. Great.
All right.
Is that yours?
Oh, no, I'm happy to sit. I think I'm wearing mics. Is anyone else wearing mics? You should be mic'd. You're not. Okay. Should I turn this on? Yes. Yes. Want this for posterity or not? Good? Okay. I'm good. All right. Lovely. So thank you, Ken, and thank you, Emily and Jenny, and all of you who are here. It's really encouraging to see this many people on a Friday afternoon interested in this topic, which I think says a lot about this topic in ways that I'd like to reflect on. I think you already have. I think your talk gave a really broad view of the issue, the crisis, with air quotes, and which is great. Of course, the downside is that I was going through my notes and crossing off, made that point. So I'm going to try to be minimally coherent and go through the points that I wanted to raise and also reflect concretely on some of the things that you said. The issue about the crisis, and I think it's hard to overemphasize how much our collective understanding of the Syrian crisis is a result of the fact that it's refracted through the prism of Western Europe and the effect on Western Europe. And again, I'll remit to your numbers, the 2120, the one being 1% of refugees that actually make it to, whether it be Western Europe, the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, developed countries, which often is where people will have the best chance of a dignified life. The fact that it has taken a crisis on Europe's doorstep to awaken the world's consciousness says so much, and it requires us, as you, I think, have done brilliantly, to sort of peel back the layers of the onion to see what's behind this. What are we talking about? It's not just these hundreds of thousands of people that have arrived these past months through Turkey in Syria. It's much bigger. And there, the sort of the comments that I wanted to raise and put out for you and for others to reflect on. You made all the points about where the numbers are. Turkey, 2.3 million people. Lebanon, the figures are shocking in Lebanon as a percentage of their population. Jordan, the 60 million people internally displaced and refugees, the IDPs, those within their country. The things that I would flag and raise for you to consider, it's fairly evident to me that the overall system is failing unless the system is designed, and I don't want to sound too jaded here, to ensure that refugees from the developing world stay in the developing world and very few of them reach the shores of developed countries. If it's designed to do that, it's doing a bang-up job. if it's designed to protect the rights of refugees and enable them to live dignified lives, not doing very well at all. And in that, the concept of burden sharing, which I think permeates international refugee law, has been lost in translation. And in translation, I mean from the international legal norms, what's in the Refugee Convention, to how, whether it be the European Union or individual European states or the United States or Canada, New Zealand, whatever other countries understand their obligations and implement them in domestic legislation. And there are a few things that I wanted to flag and sort of two ideas to throw out there. First is the idea, and this goes beyond refugees, and it has to do with human mobilization more broadly. And there, I can't help but note, a couple of days ago, and I said this in another talk last night, the report that the global temperatures in 2015 were higher than any time before except 2014. Again, if I were a betting man, I would bet on 2016 to be the next highest year of temperatures. But the point is the global displacement of people, whether they're characterized as refugees or not, that we can foresee in the next 10, 20, 30 years will dwarf even the crisis we're facing now. And the regime we have, I don't think, is prepared for that. No. So one question that I have has to do with how should we understand the consequences of the current regime globally, de facto, whatever the Refugee Convention requires, which makes human population transfers illegal. That's the norm. It's illegalized, it's criminalized in most of the world. What are the consequences of that? Let me just suggest a couple. If we look at Syria, it's trafficking in persons, it's sexual abuses, it's bilking and financial distortion, seizing people for money from people for things they shouldn't have to pay for. It's 3,900, 800 people drowning as they're trying to cross the water. It's Alan Kurdi, 3-year-old body image shocking people, but that's the tip of the iceberg of other people who have died. It's the strengthening of criminal networks. By the way, I would be remiss if I didn't force us to shift our focus more close to home and to look at how this happens between Central America and the United States, and how the illegalization of migration has strengthened criminal organizations, the Maras in Central America, other drug trafficking gangs, how it has led to mass slaughter, the loss of lives in Mexico and people coming through, hundreds and hundreds of people, in ways now that I think are foreseeable, and in ways that might ask us or force us to question whether a facially neutral norm like my country, I am prohibiting entry into my country, exercising my sovereignty in a way that is legitimate and that in no way undermines human rights, whether the known consequences to people who are fleeing situations of violence, whether the known strengthening of criminal organizations, criminal organized crime groups, drug traffickers, human traffickers, whether the deaths that occur, the sexual abuse that occurs in transit, whether all of that doesn't rise to a level when it is a totally foreseeable consequence of criminalization of migration, whether that doesn't force us to reconsider from a human rights framework, doesn't this constitute a violation of human rights? To criminalize entry into a country in a way that foreseeably causes death, destruction, and strengthening criminal organizations. And then more specifically, there's one issue that I think is under the radar screen. I flagged this in another event last week. This whole week, there's a number of events on this issue, which is great. And that's the issue of carrier sanctions. So what am I talking about? If anyone's ever gotten on a plane and flown anywhere outside of the United States, they'll always ask you for your passport and your visa. No doubt it's driven by their desire to ensure that you have an enjoyable time in the country to which you are traveling. I don't doubt the good faith of airlines, but it may also be driven by the fact that they are subject to severe financial sanctions if they don't control the visa. In other words, if they permit someone who doesn't have adequate documentation to get on a plane and then fly to another country, they will be fined by both the country that's sending and the country, particularly the country of destination. Okay, and they may lose their license to travel. You can lose your license, the FAA license, and to fly into the United States. You can lose licensing in Canada, Europe, etc. What this does, in ways that we don't really think about, but I want to make visible what is invisible, is, well, of course, refugees spend thousands of dollars to human smugglers and then travel by land and sea and put themselves at great risk to get to Europe. Yes, of course. And the reason why that is because they can't get on an airplane and fly and then present themselves at their point of arrival and say, I'm a refugee, I'm fleeing a situation of conflict. So I'm wondering about that norm and your thoughts on that norm and whether that's something your organization and other organizations are working on pushing back against. But I just wanted to finish up with a thought from François Crépeau, who's the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of migrants, and get your thoughts on this. And this is sort of at the big picture level. And here's a quote in an interview from him: as mobility is increasing with globalization, instead of resisting it, we should organize it. That means opening legal channels for people to be able to come and look for work. If you create mechanisms that incentivize people, you would not have underground immigration to such an extent that you have now with all of the concomitant dangers and horrors that we've been speaking about. So I wanted to throw that out as a frame and be curious to hear the thoughts of the experts on the panel. And thank you again for the presentation and for the invitation to those who've organized this event.
All right. Jenny, you want to go next?
Sure thing. Get my mic up and going. I'm also very glad to be here and glad to see so many people interested in this issue. And like Jim, I had many points that you touched on in your presentation, including particularly this issue of the geographic distribution of refugees and why everyone has paid so much attention to Europe when most of the world's refugees are elsewhere. I guess just to add a little bit additional information to the conversation, I think I would like to talk a little bit about how within Europe the distribution of refugees has not played out in geographically equal ways and how that relates to the overall problem posed by the global system in terms of where refugees end up and who pays for their resettlement, their integration into society, et cetera. So the biggest disproportion, of course, is outside Europe, and only 1% are getting to Europe or to other countries that might fall into similar categories. But even if you look within the European Union, there's a pretty dramatic difference in the number of refugees that states are receiving and in the rates of asylum granting. And so that, I think, has caused a lot of problems within Europe and has put the system under a lot of tension. So if you look at I will put on my slides as long as we're at it. All right. So if we just look in terms of the column on the right, and these are slides that I've stolen in fair use doctrine from the Economist magazine. But if you look both in terms of the sources of refugees in Europe and then where they've ended up, and these statistics are now a year or so out of date, but I think the overall percentages don't change, you see that there's a pretty big difference in the number of asylum applications that are accepted or rejected in different European countries, with Germany having a very high rate of acceptance, Sweden coming in second, but some countries much lower in terms of the percentage of asylum applications that are granted. We also see, here's another sort of visual representation of it. And you see that some countries, for example, France and the UK, which in terms of economic terms are better off than many of the countries in Southern Europe, receiving and accepting dramatically lower percentages of applications in positive decisions. And so that's a substantial problem in terms of the structure of the EU and what means countries within the EU have of sharing the burden. And there's been a great deal of political debate within the EU and efforts to try to allocate incoming asylum seekers in some way that would be distributed more fairly throughout the EU. And there's not the political mechanism or legal mechanism within the structure of the Union to do so, except by countries individually consenting to those decisions. There's also pretty dramatic differences in terms of the fate of people fleeing particular countries in terms of the likelihood that they will be granted asylum. So the Syrian refugees are at the #1 list in terms of people being granted asylum because I think the crisis in Syria is so clear in terms of the refugee status of those individuals under the definition in the Refugee Convention. Also high rates of grants of asylum for people from Eritrea, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran. There are a number of other individuals or large groups of people from other countries in the world who have much lower rates of asylum being granted, despite pretty desperate conditions in the places where they flee. You see that, for example, also in U.S. Refugee and asylum law and the willingness of U.S. courts to grant asylum to individuals fleeing Central America, where there might be violence by drug gangs or other things like that, that the courts and legal systems sometimes have trouble fitting into the definition under the Refugee Convention. And here, again, is one more visual representation of asylum claims in Europe, just sort of showing where they are. Of course, this, I'll move forward a little bit. Of course, this is, you know, even if you look at the distribution with Europe, the sort of unevenness between a country like Germany or a country like France or the UK is nothing compared to the global distribution. This is also now several months out of date, but you have the sort of number of Syrian refugees in neighboring countries, including, as we've already talked about, Lebanon. But if you look at the global sort of major refugee hosting countries in the end of 2014, which is now a fairly long time ago in terms of refugee flows, you see very strong numbers in the developing world. And you can see that visually also in this representation, and even more starkly in this one, where if you were to change the size of countries on the map in terms of the number of refugees that they were holding, you would see that Europe and North America are very, very small in this map. So what are some commonalities between the problems that we face within Europe and globally in terms of where refugees end up? I want to point out a couple of things. One has to do with the legal structure of the Refugee Convention. And it's a product of the time when it was written and not necessarily of later developments in the world, but also in terms of the framing of states' obligations not to return refugees to their countries of origin, where they might face a well-founded fear of persecution, but leaving a giant gaping hole in terms of being clear on what exactly happens to individuals who reach what might be called a third country of refuge. So if you face a well-founded fear of persecution in your home country, but you manage to get to some other country where you're not facing a fear of persecution, the structure of the convention does not in any way make clear through any obvious reading of it that some further down the road country that might have better economics, more opportunities for you to have a job, better living conditions, that they have any obligation to let you out of that first safe place that you've reached. And that is, I think, what some of Jim's comments highlight in terms of trying to think of new legal arguments that don't turn just on the Refugee Convention in terms of framing the obligations of states, because a straightforward reading of the Refugee Convention does not easily yield an obligation of a state further down the road on which people are fleeing to allow them to enter. On the other hand, human rights treaties might, and there are questions based on the extraterritoriality of state obligations, which is a big question in human rights law, but that might provide a further framework in international law for trying to craft more robust rights for individuals. A big problem with that, which is a problem with all of international human rights law, however, is not just the lack of enforcement mechanisms, and I think you're right, Emily, to point out that The UNHCR doesn't have a sort of adjudicatory or quasi-judicial capacity in the way that human rights bodies do. On the other hand, human rights bodies not terribly effective in terms of actual compliance or enforcement of decisions. If you look at the CEDAW committee, it's great that we have it. It's great that it issues decisions. Not entirely clear that it really moves the needle in significant, millions of lives changing kind of ways on these issues. And human rights bodies even more challenged in terms of effectiveness when the implementation of a ruling about rights requires redistribution of wealth and money, and particularly even a step beyond that, redistribution of wealth and money across international borders. And one of the big challenges here, even were we to come up with a more robust human rights law-based framework for creating obligations on the part of states further down the train in where people are fleeing, there's this serious question of the degree to which legal norms can be used effectively to compel states to reallocate economic resources. And I think you see that not just on the global level with the question of the degree to which the more developed countries are not really sharing the burden of the developing countries that have received the vast majority of the world's refugees, but also even if you look within Europe, a country that has a supranational architecture through the EU that provides for some reallocation of monetary resources within the European Union. We see that they've encountered serious difficulties in trying to move money around even within Europe to pay for the countries that are receiving more refugees. And that's perhaps the best case scenario where you have a political architecture and already mechanisms for transferring money. And even in that situation, the politics around that have proven to be very difficult to surmount. So let alone if you go beyond that. Now, of course, has been countervailing pressure on European countries, which because of domestic political pressure to not have so many, even the small number of refugees that they've actually gotten, to perhaps be willing to transfer more money to countries like Lebanon or Turkey that are holding more refugees in an attempt to help stem the flow. But I think that legal argument, international human rights law as a framework, is not really going to help solve the monetary redistribution problem in any easy terms. And so that's, I think, one of the really big challenges that's ongoing in this area.
All right, so do you want to respond to a couple of these comments, and then we'll open it up and find out what the group here is interested in talking about?
Absolutely, and please feel free if there's a point that I don't address from these two to bring it up in questions, because it's a lot to keep track of. You both made some really fantastic points. This is one of the reasons I love speaking with academics, because you are able to have so many creative ideas and to really pull out some of the overarching issues that pose challenges that we have to address. In terms of what you said originally about, or what you said initially, and then came back to with the quote at the end about reframing our whole concept of borders and the idea that countries can say, no, we don't want you to come in. I think that is, I think you're absolutely right that is a direction we need to start thinking in. I personally tend to be very pro open borders, but in terms of kind of the political realities and the spaces that Asylum Access is in, obviously there are places where saying that would just get us laughed at, if not kicked out. So, but I think it is definitely an idea worth further development, and when you start developing ideas and talking about them, sometimes people start to shift their opinions. When it comes to, I also think it's really interesting to think about how we could hold states accountable for the foreseeable consequences of their actions. The increases in organized crime, in smuggling, in actions that violate people's human rights. I think that would be a really interesting way to look at going about this. One of the challenges that I see there is that we don't have a good way to hold, for individuals to hold states accountable. You could have one state hold another state accountable, potentially, using something like the ICC, the International Criminal Court, but it's hard to see how that could be done by an individual or by a group representing individuals who were harmed. So figuring that out is a big area of challenge. I wanted to respond a little bit to this link with organized crime, or just simply the rise of crime in response to refugees' needs specifically to get out, because I think that it is worth just noting, we don't really have time to explore it today, but it's worth noting that this is actually a fairly complicated problem to solve when it comes to legislation and when it comes to kind of our more traditional responses to crime, right? Making things criminal and then assessing criminal penalties. And one quote from a former colleague of mine that I think illuminates one of the complications is he would say, you know, Schindler was a human smuggler. And when you start thinking about that, you realize, right, that when you talk about moving people across borders in ways that are not allowed, you can be talking about everything from human trafficking and, you know, absolute exploitation of someone in one of their most vulnerable moments, all the way up to something that we would regard as morally right, even if legally wrong, and everything in between. And so figuring out how you address that, and same thing with carrier sanctions, right? An airline that said, we're not going to worry about carrier sanctions if we think someone is an asylum seeker and has a valid asylum claim, or at least the right to make an asylum claim. Would we, you know, where would that fall on the spectrum? Some people would probably say morally right, even if legally wrong, and other people might have a more complicated view on it. So I think that's an issue that we have to grapple with when we address the question of criminalization and how we work in this current system that we've got, where we don't have a system of just open borders. I think when it comes to burden sharing and this concept of burden sharing, I would really like to see states take it more seriously. Certainly, I think Europe is the best hope for it in the sense that, as you say, it has this overarching structure. But to be honest, in a way, I would say that asylum access exists partly because we've kind of given up on that. When we focus on Africa, Asia, and Latin America, we focus on changing the human rights landscape for refugees where they are. Because even if, for example, you got the US to take 10 times as many refugees for resettlement as we currently do, you'd be talking about less than 5% of the refugee population in the world. It just, you could do this huge, heavy lift. I mean, it's something that's politically impossible in the US, and you would still not be really making a dent in the number of refugees. And for Europe, that's even more pronounced. Many European countries, while they have asylum systems, don't even have any sort of system of resettling refugees, which means going to a country where refugees have sought refuge and then selecting some refugees to bring to your country. So going to a country like Turkey and saying, we're going to resettle a number of refugees, we're going to bring them directly. Germany's been experimenting with a kind of temporary resettlement or temporary asylum status. UK does some resettlement, but many countries in Europe have not even done this at all. And they're starting to talk about it now, which is great. But again, we're going to talk about a few thousands in the context of millions and millions of people displaced. So to some extent, I think we have moved outside of that. That's not to say that I don't think people should work on it. And I wonder, in terms of how you would work on it, in terms of how you would move the needle in states, I think that it's probably going to be a combination of taking advantage of these political moments. And I do think that despite the fact that I might not say that Europe is truly in crisis with the number of refugees, certainly this is a political moment where there may be the opportunity to make some gains. I also think you're going to see it in terms of the way that money flows in response to refugees. In many ways, it would be much easier for countries in Europe, countries like the US, to spend more money, to give more money to countries that are hosting much larger percentages of refugees than it would be to bring people here. And so I think that's the more politically feasible way to approach it.
All right, fantastic. So we have time for some questions for any of the panelists. And Duncan, why don't you start us off?
Sure. So I have a question that combines, I guess, two of your observations. So I think the first is from Jim's, which is that the system may be structured sort of with a pessimistic view about keeping refugees out of Europe, the United States, et cetera. However, probably the goal should be to let them lead dignified lives. And Emily, your observation that one of the key drivers right now of why refugees are going to Europe is the fact that they can't lead dignified lives and don't have access to work. And we've seen that Europe to some degree is willing to pay other countries to house refugees. And I'm wondering if Europe really should be leaning on other countries to open up rights to work as a mechanism out of self-interest. So it's still that pessimistic view, but the end result is people can work and lead better lives.
Go ahead.
I would say absolutely. This is something that Asylum Access has been very active on at the global level, as well as in the countries where we're working. And I think it's the only viable way forward. And I actually think it doesn't even need to be an either or, right? Even if Germany, say, is going to agree to accept to bring refugees from Jordan to live in Germany, there's going to be some time. That's going to take some time to do that processing. It may be a matter of years. If you haven't worked for 5 years and suddenly you get to Germany and now you are allowed to work, and by the way, not all European countries allow refugees to work either. But if you get to Germany and you haven't been working for 5 years, your skills are going to be rusty. It's going to be a lot harder to get back into the workforce. So it's a solution that could be put forward even while being agnostic about what the right kind of longer-term solution is. And I think it's absolutely something that should be done, and we've got the legal foundations for it.
All right. Yeah, the next question is second row here.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions, actually. If we suspend the idea that migration is illegal, then essentially a refugee and an internal displaced person are the same, or would be the same. So I was wondering if we can cross-pollinate what we have learned from internal displacement in places like Colombia, for instance, with what we know about migrants. And the second connected question would be, at least coming from internal displacement, sometimes the hopes for development to facilitate things are too high. And I wonder if we would be putting too many of our eggs in that one basket of using development as a tool.
Sorry.
You
Yeah,
wanna
do
try
you
that?
want to start?
I'm happy to bite at the Colombia part of
Yeah.
the question, because I think it's, in very succinct terms, that the example of Colombia is highly problematic, and I think it's strongly suggestive that the plight of IDPs, internally displaced persons, is often as grave as refugees, and that the arbitrariness of having crossed or not crossed an international border, which is dispositive because of the framework of the relevant conventions, might not really be the most important distinction in terms of the real-life outcomes for people directly affected. And I wanted to clarify an impression that I may have left. When I raised the point that criminalizing human population transfers strengthens organized criminal groups and human smugglers, I am not advocating for a robust criminal prosecution mechanism against smugglers, and I recognize that Schindler was a human trafficker. It's sort of the analogy I would make to sort of criminalizing particular narcotics makes Dr. Kevorkian a criminal, but it also makes a lot of drug trafficking gangs criminals. The question is whether there's a net plus or net minus from making particular conduct illegal when the known consequences of the illegality involve strengthening criminal groups, violence, exploitation of people, sexual abuse, murder, et cetera. That's my point. But I'm not a strong advocate for we need to, and I say this from in the 1980s. I worked with refugees and in the sanctuary movement. So
Right. No, I wasn't. I didn't take your point that way.
I'm not saying that. I don't want to leave the impression that I might have advocated that.
Yeah. And I would say that actually Colombia is a very interesting example because in Ecuador is the first place that Asylum Access opened our operations, and we happened to get there right at the time that Correa had just come into office. The Constitution was being rewritten, and one of our big policy victories was getting full refugee employment rights in the Ecuadorian Constitution. So the numbers are a little bit suspect, but the official numbers are there are around 250,000 refugees, Colombian refugees in Ecuador, and they, under the Constitution, have equal employment rights with Ecuadorian nationals. They are precisely equal to Ecuadorian nationals in seeking jobs, in starting businesses, et cetera. And we've seen that they have had good outcomes. Now, I actually haven't seen a comparison. I'm thinking it would be really interesting to see how internally displaced communities within Colombia have done economically and in terms of development outcomes compared to refugees. And it's not to say that life is rosy for all refugees in Ecuador all the time, but certainly we have seen good economic outcomes for refugees, as well as good economic outcomes for Ecuador. And in fact, Ecuador's constitution, with these new rights passed, took effect in September 2008. We all know what happened to the global economy in September 2008. And for the next 5 years, Ecuador's economy grew in the midst of a global recession. And certainly there are lots of reasons you could point to, and I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to give you the full analysis, but it's an interesting point of correlation that rather than prohibiting refugees from working legally, they welcomed them into the workforce. And they saw that they were doing relatively well economically in a global downturn in a time that was where many people were struggling. And I think one other thing that's maybe interesting about comparing other regions and also looking at IDPs versus refugees is that that I think you're right. If you took away the legal prohibitions, the legal barriers that keep refugees from accessing development solutions, but also accessing just autonomy and the ability to make choices about their lives, then they look fairly similar to internally displaced people. They're someplace that's unfamiliar. They're having to navigate a new system. They've lost a lot of their assets or a lot of whatever they had, right? Assets is such a technical word, but they've left their lives behind, and they're trying to start from scratch somewhere new. And yeah, absolutely, there are a lot of things that are similar and a lot of lessons that we can learn. One thing that I think hampers breaking down those legal barriers is that it's really only in Europe that UNHCR has invested in jurisprudence around refugee law. And so, yeah, you're right. The law, you made the point that law only goes so far when you're trying to persuade states to do something and you don't have an enforcement mechanism. And I think you're right about that. But also, we haven't even invested in kind of making the point legally about what refugees are entitled to in places other than Europe. And it's striking that UNHCR has invested in jurisprudence around refugee human rights in Europe, but not elsewhere.
Right, in back. Yeah.
Thank you. I have two questions for you, Emily. One, so one of the primary economic arguments for why a country should take refugees is that they tend to create jobs because they're more likely to be entrepreneurial. But at the same time, there's an argument to be said that they tend to create more businesses because they reach a ceiling and because they suffer from discrimination when they reach a country because they're refugees for a variety of reasons. Considering that's like one of the main reasons a country should take refugees in the first place, how do we balance these conflicting values of equal treatment in the workplace and to creating jobs for the overall economy and therefore being able to have these refugees live in a country in the first place? And the second question I have is, so the background for this is that I spent the last 3 months in Berlin, where I spoke with a variety of stakeholders with the refugee crisis in Europe. And it's very difficult, it seems to be very difficult to have this solid distinction between what is a pure refugee and what is an economic migrant. Because the only case in which a Syrian refugee comes to Europe purely for like a war reason is if Syria had an equivalent, if the Syrian refugee had an equivalent socioeconomic status in their home country, which is clearly not true. It's demonstrated by a variety of metrics, from GDP to the Gini coefficient to a variety of other things. So where do you draw the line between what's a refugee and what is an economic migrant? And why shouldn't we be taking economic migrants? Because technically, everyone has an equal right in the world to what is equal opportunity and the ability to achieve whatever they can in their lifetime.
So really interesting questions. So I'm going to start from the legal side, and then we can kind of get to the values side of the questions. And from the legal perspective, as I said, a refugee is someone who has a well-founded fear of being persecuted or being in a civil war, and so can't go home. And so when you're looking at the situation of, what motivates someone to leave their country, are they an economic migrant or are they a refugee? I think there are political drivers, right? Their governments often would like to say that, well, you didn't really leave because you're afraid. But even if a refugee, or even if someone fleeing their country judges that their best opportunity lies, say, in Berlin, rather than in Amman or Ankara, that the factor that causes them to leave, we can look at the factor that causes them to leave independent of that, right? We can look at what's happening in Syria. Is it safe? Not just is it safe for someone to live there, but would someone be reasonable in saying, I can't count on staying alive if I live here? That's enough. It doesn't matter if there are other reasons that also influence the way that they make decisions, right? We're humans, we make decisions for complicated, multifaceted reasons. But if you can't live in your country because you might die, if you can't live in your country because you might be arrested and tortured, then you meet the legal definition of a refugee. When you come to the moral question, I think what underlies international law, and the reason that Asylum Access goes to the Refugee Convention and to international refugee law as a foundation for our work, is we go there because this is the best consensus we've got as a global community, right? Rather than being some American coming in and saying, well, this is what I think you ought to do. I'm drawing my moral authority, if you will, from the consensus of the international community. And the reason the international community has given refugees a specific right to be outside their country and to enjoy asylum, to seek and enjoy asylum, is because we think there's a difference morally between someone who's facing immediate death, torture, persecution, and someone who is facing poverty, general poverty. Now, I think there are some arguments to be made that there's some blurred lines when you're in a situation where, for example, because of conflict, there's now famine because the fields haven't been tended and there have been battles over the places that people would have grown food. So you could say that someone, who survived the war, maybe was born after the war and was growing up starving to death, barely, not able to get adequate nutrition. I think there's an argument to be made. Well, shouldn't they qualify as a refugee as well? They can't, they can't live. They're impacted by this war. So there are definitely some blurry areas in that. But when you think about the ends of that spectrum, you can understand that someone facing immediate death versus someone who's not able to buy a PlayStation are in two different places, and the international community has said we have different moral obligations to these different groups of people. And then when it comes to the question about refugees being entrepreneurial and what drives them to be entrepreneurial, certainly I think just kind of on a common sense level, I think you're probably right that people face discrimination, even in countries, even in Ecuador, where you have this constitutional right to equal employment. You don't see equal hiring practices, right? You still see refugees discriminated against. You still see people who will tell you that they're all drug dealers and thieves and they're never going to hire a Colombian. And so yes, probably that is one of the things that drives refugee populations to be more entrepreneurial than others. But the economic impact of that is that you have more jobs being created by refugees who start businesses, and at least some of them eventually hire others.
I'll just add one little thing to what Emily said. I think that it is really important to know that whatever moral claims we might make about the equivalence of different reasons that people might have in their right to access a better life, there's a very clear legal distinction in the Refugee Convention between someone who meets the definition of a refugee, which is someone who has a well-founded fear of persecution on the convention grounds. One of the additional ways that it's tricky, I think, is that people leave Syria as refugees, clearly. They have a well-founded fear of persecution in that country on one of the convention grounds. They get to another country, they're in Turkey, right? They're still a refugee from Syria. They can't return to their country of origin. But the reason why they want to leave Turkey and go to Germany is not because they're being persecuted in Turkey, although they might be. Actually, it's conceivable that they could be, but that's an economic migration step. And that's where I think a lot of the resistance on the part of European countries to the further movement of those people comes from. Because they are still refugees, but the reason they're moving from Lebanon or Turkey is on the basis of jobs.
And I think this highlights something that the international refugee response system has been extremely bad about addressing, which is, let's be honest, refugee camps are illegal. And yet they have been the primary mode that the UN and international humanitarian agencies use to respond to refugees. We are locking people up. I mean, that would be considered persecution if a country said, we're going to lock you up, not based on anything, not based on anything other than the fact that you're a refugee who's come into our country. If a country said, we're going to lock you up because, you're based on no other reason but that you're Christian or that you're Muslim or that you belong to this family that is politically, on the part of the political opposition, we would say that's a human rights violation and you're entitled, that not only a human rights violation, but that is persecution, and you're entitled to asylum in another country. And yet when it's UN sanctioned being locked up, we don't call that a human rights violation. And so then we say that, oh, well, refugees coming into Europe from, because they fled Zatri. And I talked to some women in Jordan who had left Zatri, and the word they all used was, we escaped. They literally paid somebody to take them out through the desert in a 4x4 truck because they weren't allowed to leave legally. So.
Christoph.
Thanks. I just have a couple of questions or points that are related to points, actually. My first one relates to the numbers that you mentioned originally. I think if I remember correctly, you mentioned there are about 20 million refugees in the world, and that fewer than 1% are in North America, Europe, and so on. Now, I don't really know anything about this, but when I look at what I read about this, then I read that Europe or Germany alone accepted more than or about 1 million refugees last year. And I actually just checked the Eurostat numbers, the official statistical office of the European Union, which doesn't mean that the numbers are correct, but they claim that the EU accepted 1.2 million refugees in 2015. So that's quite a bit more than 1%. So I don't know how these numbers match, but I just want to see what your reaction is to that. And related to that, maybe I'd like to focus a little bit more on the US and look at the bottom of the figure there. When the figure was presented, and these are actually 2014 numbers, not 2015, the comment that was made was, well, Europe and the United States don't really accept all that many refugees. But when I look at Europe here, I see that Europe is about as big as Turkey in the figure, and that the United States is non-existent. It's just a line that connects Canada to Brazil or something like that, because they wanted to show that it is actually connected over land. So as a US citizen, I feel a little bit more ashamed, I would say, than as a Belgian citizen. And so I was wondering whether maybe we have not been a bit too much US biased in the presentations.
I'm really glad that you asked that question because I think that, first of all, it illuminates one of the challenges of comparing apples to apples when we're talking about numbers. So I believe that I'm not sure which Eurostat numbers you were looking at, but I believe that those numbers are a combination of refugees and migrants, and that certainly the numbers that have been coming out have said that Germany is expecting to receive 1 million refugees and migrants, people coming across their border. Those claims have not yet been adjudicated. Some of those people will be refugees, some of them will not be refugees. And so when you're looking at the statistics, and it is less than 1%. It's been less than 1% every year for which we have data. We don't have the 2015 numbers yet because you haven't gotten decisions. We haven't gotten decisions on many cases that happened during 2015. It's possible that number will go up. It almost certainly will not be 1 million actual refugees, people who are identified and determined to be refugees. And then you get into the issue that Jenny talked about, which is, okay, how much do you want to trust a state's decision as to whether someone is a refugee or is not a refugee? In the US, I think of our asylum claims, if I remember correctly, and this is off the top of my head, so bear with me, but I think it's something like 23% of the claims for asylum are accepted. So, then you can say, okay, well, do we think the U.S. made the right decision in most of those situations? And certainly I can point you to specific case examples where I think the US made absolutely the wrong decision. But how does that play out? You know, if the courts say the 23% of the asylum claimants are actually refugees, then who oversees the courts, or who second guesses the courts?
Just to follow up, though, on Christoph's question, I would like to get kind of an international law perspective on, okay, so whether or not there's a refugee crisis in Europe may depend on the numbers, but there's no doubt a refugee-induced governance crisis in Europe, in which the would-be 1.2 million refugees have generated a crisis about the possibility of free movement within Europe, how the external borders of Europe are going to be governed, and it's generated all sorts of debate within countries and across Europe about different policy proposals. And those policy proposals in some ways seem to fly in the face of international law. Based on the definitions that you've given us here today, one would think that quotas are not a internationally law allowed sort of public policy, but they are the most common way to think about either the distribution within Europe or just the policies that individual countries are going to develop. And so I guess I think that would be interesting for this audience is to talk a little bit about policy alternatives that are available to Europe in thinking about how to implement more politically sustainable refugee policies that are still consistent with the international legal obligations of the EU as a whole and of the individual members.
Jenny, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think this crisis is definitely a crisis for Europe, right? Whether Europe is the most important segment of the global refugee crisis or not is one question, but there's no doubt that it is a political and humanitarian crisis within Europe, and it comes at a difficult time for Europe in terms of governance, in terms of just looking from 2008 onwards in terms of economic pressure and the ability of the EU to deal with things like Greece and the monetary issues and economic issues that have come up in that context. And at the same time, the sort of influx of refugees combined with Islamophobia, which is exacerbated by, for example, the Paris attacks, has led to resurgence in right-wing political parties in a lot of European countries. And so the whole European project is under stress in a way that has come to a head as a result, in part, of these issues. And I think that one of the difficulties is that there are not clear legal rules, for example, on how these refugees should be distributed among the European countries, which leaves it largely to the political realm. Europe had for a long time had a rule that your point of first entry into the European Union was the place that you had to seek asylum. So if you landed in Greece, you were supposed to stay in Greece. That practice came under pressure from the European Court of Human Rights, which prior to the most recent round of issues had previously held that under the European Convention on Human Rights, people could not necessarily be sent back from Belgium to Greece if the conditions that would meet them on their return there would not satisfy the convention in terms of various standards. But the movement of peoples under the Schengen Agreement, which has come under pressure in terms of open border movement throughout Europe when people come in at one place and then want to migrate for economic reasons from Greece, which has very serious economic problems to Northern Europe. I think that the legal framework of the EU doesn't provide a clear answer, which puts it to the political realm. And that's where the states in Europe and the rise of domestic factions that are very strongly opposed to immigration and have a kind of xenophobic element and a nationalistic element that may be opposed to the project of Europe entirely, creates just a really strong political crisis for the EU right now.
Do you guys have
Just an analogy that's of interest to the Americas, but I know you're going to talk about Europe. And just that the principle that Jenny is talking about presumes in order to work effectively that every country will be in fact a safe third country, that every country will meet the minimum standards required and implement them as deemed as required by the Refugee Convention. The issue that comes up is when that's not the case, and the European Court has weighed in there. In the Americas, the Inter-American Commission has weighed in a matter in which there's an agreement between the United States and Canada called the Safe Third Country Agreement, whereby people seeking asylum at the border, if you come into Canada from the United States or vice versa, the norm is to return the person on the theory that you've come from whatever country you come from, say Syria, you're in Canada, you're coming to the United States, you need to apply for asylum in Canada. That's not really the problem. The problem is people who come into the United States and want to get into Canada and avail themselves of Canada's refugee protections, which more closely align with the requirements of the Refugee Convention that Canada has agreed through a bilateral treaty with the United States to return to the United States. And the Inter-American Commission decided that the United States does not meet the standards of the Refugee Convention. So again, just as an example, the same thing in Europe, it's the same principle.
Yeah.
It's that we can all decide that we will all, in this European Union or any other political body, African Union, any other body, we will all apply this equally. But in practice, if any given country is not applying the standards, then the country that's returning a person to that country is liable under the convention to ensure that the refugee applicant is granted full rights that she or he deserves.
All right, thank you very much. I unfortunately have been told that we have to end now, but I want to thank you all for coming, and I especially want to ask you to help me in thanking our panelists for a terrific conversation and presentation.